Trump's anti-immigrant onslaught sparks fresh alarm heading into 2024. His comments have renewed concern from Latino leaders, civil rights groups, and experts on extremism, particularly as Trump has established a wide lead in polls of the Republican primary. Donald Trump has denigrated undocumented immigrants in recent weeks by accusing them of poisoning the blood of our country, associating them with drug and alcohol use, and portraying them as dangerous threats to Americans, prompting widespread criticism and denunciations of racism and xenophobia from immigrant and civil rights groups. During a recent rally in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the former president said, "These people are very aggressive, they drink, they have drugs, a lot of things happening." In Dubuque, Iowa, last month, he told his audience, "It's the blood of our country, what they're doing is destroying our country." And in New Hampshire on Monday, Trump baselessly accused immigrants crossing the Mexican border of being involved in the recent attacks on Israel. "People are pouring into our country, and we have no idea from where they come," he said. Disparaging many immigrants and embracing hardline border policies are tactics that have long been central to Trump's political identity and governing agenda, dating to his first campaign speech in 2015. Trump's recent comments, coming as President Biden has struggled to contain an increase in illegal crossings at the southern border, reflect the ex-president's effort to put the border and immigration at the forefront of his bid to return to the White House. His at times escalating attacks have energized his base of supporters while prompting a growing wave of alarm from immigrant advocates, particularly as Trump is the clear polling leader in the race for the GOP nomination. Domingo Garcia, president of the League of United Latin American Citizens, the oldest Hispanic civil rights group in the country, said that Trump's comments about blood indicate his language is getting more extreme, comparing it to Nazi propaganda about Jewish people, and that more people should be paying attention ahead of the 2024 election. He appears to be taking pages from the Hitler-Nazi playbook and using them in this production to divide Americans and engage in tribalism, Garcia said. And he's succeeding to a certain extent. Civil rights advocates and experts in extremism and immigration policy have compared Trump's poisoning the blood remark to language used by Adolf Hitler in his book Mein Kampf, in which he told Germans to care for the purity of their own blood by eliminating Jews. Trump launched his 2016 campaign by calling undocumented immigrants from Mexico rapists who are bringing drugs and crime into the country. As president, he signed an executive order limiting travel from several Muslim-majority countries that faced numerous court challenges, added new barriers along the southern border and drew backlash for his administration's policy that separated migrant families. Now, civil rights groups including the Anti-Defamation League, which fights anti-Semitism, and LULAC, are warning that his suggestion in a recent interview that undocumented immigrants coming across the southern border are poisoning the blood of our country could inspire violence against minorities and reflects rhetoric used by white nationalists. John Lewis, a research fellow at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University, said that poisoning language has directly appealed to people in the past who have gone on to commit violence against minorities, citing the El Paso and Tree of Life synagogue mass shooters. These were both events that were driven by a deeply white supremacist, deeply anti-immigrant set of conspiracies and a coherent anti-immigrant worldview that was centered on dehumanizing the other, he said. And in this context, I think it's always going to be deeply concerning when we see the continued proliferation of what are openly white supremacist dog whistles that will likely inspire more individuals to engage in offline conduct targeting these communities. When asked about Trump's interview with the National Pulse, a right-leaning website, in which he made the poisoning comments, his campaign spokesperson Stephen Chung said, "That's a normal phrase that is used in everyday life, in books, television, movies, and in news articles. For anyone to think that is racist or xenophobic is living in an alternate reality, consumed with faux outrage." Across his campaign rallies, Trump devotes significant portions of his speeches to the border and to immigration, speaking in often exaggerated and graphic terms. He paints a bleak picture of the country, associating undocumented immigrants with gangs such as MS-13 and suggesting they're taking up educational resources in cities like Los Angeles. The Supreme Court ruled in 1982 that public school districts can't turn away students because they are undocumented. "We're going to have the largest deportation operation in history," he said to loud applause during a Saturday campaign event in Waterloo, Iowa. While Trump promised to deport millions during his first term, he was unable to do so because of resistance from Democratic state and local officials and budget and staffing shortages in immigration enforcement. 2 days later, in New Hampshire, the crowd cheered as Trump recounted a poem he often recites about a woman who aids a snake and is bitten, comparing immigrants seeking refuge in America to bloodthirsty reptiles. Angela Kelly, chief policy advisor at the American Immigration Lawyers Association and a former senior counselor for the Department of Homeland Security under Biden, said Trump repeating his ideas has normalized crude, false notions about immigrants that do not actually advance policy that would address the crisis. Advocates say migrants are fleeing violence, government repression and poverty in hopes of a better life in the United States. Just because he repeats it doesn't make it any less dangerous, she said. While Trump has associated migrants with acts of violence, evidence has shown that undocumented immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than native-born Americans. Trump's assertion in New Hampshire that those same people who just attacked Israel are coming into the United States is also false, analysts said. Alex Norast, who has studied crime and immigration data at the Cato Institute, testified before Congress last month that 9 foreign-born terrorists entered the country illegally from 1975 to last year, but only 3 of those people crossed the Mexican border, while the others came from Canada. And there is no evidence any Hamas-affiliated terrorist has crossed the southern border, either. There are many problems at the border without exaggerating what we're seeing, Norast told the Washington Post. Promoting ideas to combat illegal immigration and drug trafficking has galvanized the Republican base in recent years, and candidates up and down the ballot have embraced variations of the positions and rhetoric Trump has exemplified. In the Republican primary this year, Trump and some of his rivals have championed militarily attacking cartels in Mexico. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has proposed using deadly force to combat drug smugglers breaching the border. It's gone one step further, and the tenor has changed as a result, Cristobal Ramon, an immigration senior policy advisor at the Latino advocacy organization Unidos US. The Republicans' ideas are resonating on the right, as migrant crossings of the U.S.-Mexico border have soared under the Biden administration. Administration officials said this month that they would fast-track the construction of new barriers along the border as well as reinstate direct deportation flights to Venezuela. The rise in migrants has led to increased criticism of the Biden administration from Democratic officials including New York Mayor Eric Adams and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. In interviews, attendees at the recent Trump events in Iowa and New Hampshire ranked the border as among their top issues of concern and said they agreed broadly with Trump's statements, even if some said they were not thrilled with his delivery. When asked what issue was most important, Vicki Gander, 72, a registered Republican in Iowa who is volunteering for Trump, responded, building the wall, because a lot of things are going to happen, bad things, and they're already happening. I mean, even the Democratic governors are upset. Craig Robinson, an Iowa-based GOP consultant, attributed the concern over the border to the nature of having presidential contests in Iowa frequently. That kind of drives this issue to the forefront more so, he said. Another factor, not to be overlooked, is while Iowa is in the middle of the country, we have immigration issues here because we're at the crossroads of Interstate 80 and 35. In 2021, there were about 11.2 million undocumented immigrants living within the United States, according to the Migration Policy Institute, the largest bump since 2015 after fewer people were crossing the border during the coronavirus pandemic in 2020. Census data showed that between 2019 and 2021, migration from Central America and Venezuela increased. Lane Solier, a 24-year-old tile worker, was one of thousands who piled into an auditorium in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, to hear the former president, whom he voted for before and said he would again. Solier said he agreed with the sentiment of Trump's comments because immigration has made it more difficult for him to earn a competitive wage, but he said Trump's remarks could be said with more tact. There are things that could be said better, he said. But you aren't voting for the way someone talks. You are voting for what they do. Ellen Casanello, who drove 7 hours from her home in New York to hear Trump speak, agreed with his comments on immigration, arguing that it isn't controversial to say migrants should come to the United States only if they have gone through the legal process. She added that she believes those criticizing Trump are only doing so because they don't want him to win the election. Maria Sacchetti contributed to this report. How the right's elevation of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. could now backfire. The American right's efforts to elevate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. were as transparent as they were cynical. The idea, as advanced by Stephen K. Bannon and the like, was clearly to try to embarrass President Biden in the Democratic primary. So they used Kennedy's inflated early poll standing as an excuse to treat the primary challenge from a fringe figure as something real and threatening. Fox News picked up the ball and ran with it, publishing many dozens of stories and featuring him regularly on air. House Republicans even invited him to testify on Capitol Hill. It hasn't worked. And now, it's looking as if the whole thing could backfire. The latest indications are that Kennedy will end his Democratic primary challenge against Biden and instead run in the general election. Mediaite reported Friday that he will declare an independent bid on October 9, and Kennedy is now teasing a major announcement on that date, while saying and doing the kinds of things that suggest Mediaite's report is accurate. Asked to comment on whether the report was true, Kennedy's campaign merely responded with a link to a video previewing his October 9 announcement. And while Kennedy is a lifelong Democrat from the country's preeminent Democratic family, there is plenty of reason to believe that a third-party bid could hurt Donald Trump more than Biden. There is no good polling that tests a Kennedy third-party bid. What we do know is that Republicans like Kennedy a heck of a lot more than Democrats do. That was true pretty shortly after he launched his campaign in April, and the gap has now grown into a chasm. The latest polling from Quinnipiac University shows that Republicans like Kennedy by a 30-point margin, 48% favorable to 18% unfavorable. Democrats, meanwhile, have developed an overwhelming distaste. The Quinnipiac poll shows just 14% have a favorable opinion of him, compared with 57% who have an unfavorable one. Democrats never particularly liked Kennedy, despite what you might have been led to believe. But he's gone from 14 points underwater, more unfavorable than favorable, with them in mid-June, to 23 points underwater in late June, to 26 points in July, to 31 points in August, and now to 43 points underwater. As for Republicans, they like Kennedy better than they like many of the top GOP presidential candidates. They even like him better than entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy and former Vice President Mike Pence, and about as much as former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley and Senator Tim Scott, Republican, South Carolina. Only Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis are clearly more popular. He's about as polarizing, with Republicans in favor and Democrats opposed, as Ramaswamy. And he's less popular among Democrats than Haley and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. Imagine if any of these GOP candidates were to drop out and wage a third-party campaign, we could be talking about a potential spoiler for Trump's general election hopes, not Biden's. This comes with some caveats. One big one is that we don't know what kind of ballot access Kennedy might get in key states, a hurdle for any third-party candidate. The New York Times previously reported that he had been in talks with the Libertarian Party, which could help with that, but running on his own would mean collecting large amounts of signatures. The vast majority of states have fairly easy ballot access requirements for presidential candidates who run outside the two major parties, said third-party ballot access expert Richard Winger. But Winger added that Kennedy would have a far easier ballot access path as the Libertarian nominee. Another caveat is that it matters which voters might be up for grabs in a contest between Trump and Biden. While a greater percentage of Republicans than Democrats like Kennedy, indications seem to be that Kennedy's potential base, conspiratorial, anti-establishment, anti-vaccine people, overlaps significantly with Trump-oriented voters. If those voters like Kennedy but already have a home, it mitigates the impact. But even many Trump-skeptical Republicans like him. While his numbers in the Quinnipiac poll were better among Republicans who backed Trump in the GOP primary, 53% favorable to 17% unfavorable, his split among non-Trump supporting GOP primary voters was still well in positive territory, at 40-18. We've also seen that the number of Republican-leaning voters who are dissatisfied with Trump as their nominee rivals the number of Democrats who are dissatisfied with Biden as their option. And these numbers suggest that Kennedy has significantly more appeal to the political right than to the political left. Kennedy has so little political appeal on the left, as we recapped from a poll this summer in New Hampshire, that very few left-leaning voters see him as an option. The survey also asked people to use one word to describe Kennedy, and the most popular words among Democratic-leaning voters were crazy, dangerous, insane, nutjob, conspiracy, and crackpot. That same poll still showed Kennedy polling 10% in the state's Democratic primary, compared to Biden's 70%. But Kennedy was the second choice of only 4% of voters. Furthermore, the survey asked about a scenario in which Biden isn't on the ballot. There is wrangling over whether he'll participate, given a dispute over the primary calendar, and only 3% of Biden voters said they would instead vote for Kennedy in that case. 65% said they would simply write in Biden. These are not the numbers of someone who is seriously competing for the nomination. These are the numbers of someone with a distinctly low ceiling. And that's a ceiling whose proximity to the floor has long been clear, but which some people have chosen to ignore for their own reasons. Those people who elevated Kennedy are apparently about to confront a very different situation, which might not play out quite as they had hoped. How Republicans lauded RFK Jr. before he was a threat. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced Monday that he would end his primary challenge to President Biden and instead run for the White House as an independent. And with the announcement, not only did a long-running GOP effort to elevate him in the service of embarrassing Biden go up in smoke, but Kennedy now appears to pose a potential spoiler threat by taking more votes from former President Donald Trump than Biden. What has resulted is a remarkable turnabout in how Republicans and the right talk about Kennedy. In recent days, the Republican National Committee has called Kennedy just another radical, far-left Democrat while detailing 23 reasons Republicans should oppose him. RNC Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel said Kennedy is a typical elitist liberal, and voters won't be fooled. And Trump's campaign made it even clearer that it fears a potential spoiler candidacy from Kennedy, who is much more popular with Republicans than Democrats. Voters should not be deceived by anyone who pretends to have conservative values, Trump spokesman Stephen Chung said in a statement. He added that an RFK candidacy is nothing more than a vanity project for a liberal Kennedy to cash in on his family's name. This is a far cry from how the right, and even Trump himself, once talked about Kennedy. And to the extent MAGA voters are fooled into thinking he's one of them, Republicans will have themselves to blame. While Republicans are now pitching Kennedy as an opportunist and a radical, Trump in late June vouched for Kennedy's character and common sense. He's a very smart guy, and a good guy, Trump said, adding, he's a very good man, and his heart is in the right place. He's a common sense guy, and so am I, Trump said. So, whether you're conservative or liberal, common sense is common sense. While they now suggest Kennedy should be persona non grata for conservative voters, key Trump-aligned strategists, including Stephen K. Bannon and Roger Stone, have pushed Kennedy as a possible running mate for Trump. Stone in April called a Trump-Kennedy ticket a dream ticket, while Bannon said 2 months ago that it would lead to a massive landslide in Trump's favor. Bannon even called Kennedy's more liberal views irrelevant in the broader context. I understand that he doesn't have policies on life and guns that are absolutely perfect and aligned with MAGA, there's no doubt about that, but he's talking about the central issues facing the country, as Donald Trump is, and that's why the other stuff is irrelevant, Bannon said in June, referring to Trump's Make America Great Again motto. This is how Republicans often talked about Kennedy, acknowledging the ways in which he is out of step with the GOP but playing down the significance of that. The other leading contender for the Republican presidential nomination, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, acknowledged those political differences in late July. But he also said he might appoint Kennedy to a key position at the Food and Drug Administration or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Another candidate who has made inroads with MAGA Republicans, Vivek Ramaswamy, has also floated Kennedy as his possible running mate. And Bannon and Stone have hardly been the only conservative media influencers to sing Kennedy's praises. When Kennedy launched his campaign in April, then Fox News host Tucker Carlson also vouched for Kennedy's character and alignment with the MAGA movement on the most important issues. Bobby Kennedy himself is not extreme. He is deeply insightful, and above all he is honest, Carlson said, adding, we're not Democrats, but Bobby Kennedy is one of the most remarkable people we have ever met, and we are honored to have him on our show. While the Trump campaign now calls Kennedy's campaign a vanity project, Carlson assured of Kennedy, he's not running to get rich. He's trying to make things better. House Republicans also invited Kennedy to testify in July, an extraordinary invitation for a current presidential candidate, and promoted him as a serious combatant in the battle against censorship. "It's why Mr. Kennedy is running for president, to help us expose and stop what's going on," said Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, now a top GOP candidate to become House Speaker. Representative Chip Roy, Republican, Texas, added while introducing Kennedy, "It is for this that Mr. Kennedy finds himself receiving the scorn of both the political left and right, because if one dares challenge the orthodoxy of the powers that be, then one is their enemy." It was around that time that the right's sudden interest in Kennedy did prove too much for at least one Republican congresswoman. Shortly before the hearing, none other than Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, GA, stepped forward to urge her party to slow its roll in embracing him. "So I agree with Bobby Kennedy on a lot of things," she said, citing his position on vaccines and the CIA, "but I tell you what, I think there's a lot of Republicans that have been fooled by him. He's not a Republican, everyone. He's very much a Democrat. Now he's an independent. And a lot of Republicans are probably wishing they had heeded Greene's advice earlier." Sean Hannity's predictable heel turn on RFK Jr. Once upon a time, it seemed that Sean Hannity was excited about no presidential candidate more than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In June, the Fox News host marveled that Kennedy was surging in the Democratic primary, potentially meaning that President Biden's bid for renomination was in jeopardy. Kennedy wasn't surging in the polls, at least not among Democrats, but Hannity seemed perfectly happy to try to will such a surge into existence. In late July, he turned over a full hour of his program to Kennedy, the sort of campaign contribution that he normally reserved for Republican candidates, as he did so often before last year's midterm elections. Kennedy was running against a Democrat, and that was good enough for Hannity. So he welcomed Kennedy to a town hall in front of a live audience, though the only one asking questions was Sean Hannity. Those questions were no less pointed than the ones 2022 Republican candidates faced. Kennedy's challenge to Biden was framed in near-heroic terms, positioning the conspiracy theory enthusiast as the sole person brave enough to challenge the Democratic establishment. Many of his fellow Democrats and others in the media mob, make no mistake, they are right now furious with RFK Jr., Hannity said as he was introducing his guest. They seem to loathe his stance on medical freedom and privacy, a sanitization of Kennedy's anti-vaccine stance. They are angry he does not toe the party line on the war in Ukraine and former President Donald Trump. They can't seem to stand that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a free thinker with classic liberal principles. And today, well, today's Democratic Party is about compliance. It's about going along. It's about groupthink. So Hannity was happy to provide a soapbox. About 2.2 million people tuned into Hannity's program that night, about in line with Hannity's regular weeknight audience. They heard Hannity tee up a number of issues on which he could express agreement, from economic insecurity to the effort to sideline hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID-19. Hannity made clear his welcoming intent at the outset. "We definitely don't agree on everything," he said, "but that's not my role here tonight. We're not going to shut down Robert F. Kennedy Jr." He noted that some people wanted to deplatform Kennedy because he regularly spreads misinformation about vaccine safety, though Hannity didn't mention that. "I actually believe in freedom and freedom of speech and the freedom of the American people to hear things that they may disagree with and ascertain and determine for themselves whether they agree or don't agree," Hannity solemnly stated. Then Kennedy announced that he would run not as a Democrat against Biden but as an independent, against both Biden and whoever wins the Republican nomination for president. That almost certainly means running against Hannity's friend Donald Trump. It also may mean pulling more support from Trump than from Biden, which is very much not what Hannity or other Republicans would like to see. So, when Kennedy again joined Hannity on Tuesday night, he earned a much briefer and colder reception. "Everybody is now trying to analyze, whether there's a three-way race with you, Donald Trump and Joe Biden," Hannity said as he began his interview. "Who would you more likely draw from? So I hope you don't mind, but I did a little research on you. You're pretty liberal," he continued. "You've called for curbing logging, oil drilling, fracking. You wanted to eliminate it and call it a victory for democracy. You want to curb U.S. fossil fuel extraction, keep it in the ground. You once tweeted you want a ban on fossil fuel extraction, a ban on fracking. You called the NRA once a terror group. You supported over the years Democrats, Al Gore, John Kerry, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. You praised Bernie Sanders multiple times. You support affirmative action. So why is this party of yours, why didn't they even allow you to compete? Because that's as pretty liberal of a record as anybody I know. Kennedy responded to this unsubtle line of questioning with a chuckle, noting that Hannity didn't really ask any question. Do you want to talk about my positions, Sean, he asked, or do you want to read talking points from the Trump campaign? Excuse me, Hannity replied. These are called Hannity points. I do my own research. This is certainly possible in theory. But it is true that, on Tuesday, the Republican National Committee published a list of Kennedy's positions intended to frame him as unacceptably liberal. The list included most of the assertions Hannity presented in introducing his guest. It's also the case that Kennedy's announcement had already triggered Republican condemnation. Last week, Semaphore reported on the Trump campaign's preparations to undercut the independent. Kennedy can be forgiven for drawing that line. At times, Hannity's prosecution of Kennedy on Tuesday was almost revelatory, a glimpse of what might be possible in a world where Hannity didn't dedicate his show night after night to aiding Trump or Trump's party. Do you still believe the NRA is a terror group? Hannity asked, for example. I support the Second Amendment, Kennedy replied, like I do all the amendments in the Constitution. I didn't ask you if you support the Second Amendment, Hannity firmly interjected. In 2018, you said Parkland students are right, the NRA's a terror group. Do you believe that? I don't consider the NRA a terror group, Kennedy replied, seemingly chastened. The segment ended with Hannity and Kennedy sparring over the feasibility of replacing fossil fuels, with Hannity insisting that Kennedy's claims weren't true, something that it's hard to imagine him saying during a Trump interview. But, then, Hannity's interviews are focused on helping Trump, not hurting him. It's understandable that Kennedy would want to do Hannity's show, given the uphill task he faces in winning the presidency. But it's surprising that he wouldn't have been prepared for a very different reception from Hannity now that he'll probably be running against Hannity's friend. Mitt Romney urges his donors to coalesce behind one challenger to Trump. Park City, Utah, alarmed by the dominance of Donald Trump less than 100 days before the Iowa caucuses, Senator Mitt Romney, Republican, Utah, urged an influential group of his one-time campaign donors to help narrow the GOP field to one viable challenger who can face off against the former president for the nomination. Romney, one of the most outspoken Republican critics of Trump, addressed his longtime financial backers at a gathering in Park City less than a month after announcing that he will not run for re-election next year. Free from those constraints, he did not mince words when describing the dysfunction in his party just days after Representative Kevin McCarthy, California, was ousted as House Speaker by a faction of far-right Republicans led by Representative Matt Gaetz, FLA, a Trump acolyte. I think our party has multiple personality disorder, and I think the Democratic Party does as well, the 2012 Republican presidential nominee said Tuesday during a fireside chat with his former running mate, Paul D. Ryan. I think we're schizophrenic. We don't know what we are or what we stand for within our party. The policy gathering, known as the E2 Summit, so named for experts and enthusiasts, was launched by Romney a decade ago, before he became a U.S. Senator, and has been helmed by Ryan since 2019. In a wide-ranging discussion that touched on what the U.S. role should be in the conflict between Hamas and Israel, as well as the threats to the United States posed by China, Russia, and Iran, both Romney and Ryan expressed concern about the GOP's ability to grapple with those complex issues. Romney said he told Ryan that he had no clear answer when Ryan asked him what the conservative movement would look like after Trump. Ryan touched on his own concern that the party is now driven by populism untethered to principles and more frequently tethered to the cult of Donald Trump's personality. The former House Speaker defined the Republican Party's problem as such: a guy, he's 77 years old, and he's got like 91 counts, and he's got a shelf life. Hopefully it's February, but maybe it's a little longer, Ryan said, alluding to the dozens of criminal charges Trump faces in multiple trials next year. Earlier in the day, the group heard from four of the contenders vying for the Republican presidential nomination, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Chris Christie and Doug Burgum, in sessions that were closed to the press. Ryan on Tuesday night asked Romney to pinpoint how soon donors would have to coalesce around one candidate, essentially forcing lower-tier candidates from the race to avoid the train wreck coming that would be Trump clinching the GOP nomination. With Trump maintaining a wide lead in polls of the GOP race, Romney acknowledged that a train wreck is the most likely scenario, but not necessary. Speaking as a former presidential nominee, Romney said it would be difficult for the candidates to bow out of the race even if they believed it was in the best interest of the country. Narrowing the field, he argued, will hinge on the willingness of the donors who are financing them to say it's time to step aside. Romney predicted that multiple candidates will try to stay in the race for the early contests in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, though some will run out of money before then. He said he viewed the end of February as D-Day. "I'd like it to coalesce earlier, I just think it has to happen," Romney said. "I want to put responsibility on your shoulders as the people who are financing campaigns to have some say as to when it's time for the person you support to say, okay, I'm getting behind someone else." In an interview with the Washington Post previewing his decision not to run for re-election in Utah, Romney said he was concerned about how difficult it had become for the U.S. House to operate. He also expressed his dissatisfaction with the potential choice before voters in the general election, stating that President Biden is unable to lead on important matters and Trump is unwilling to lead on important matters. He elaborated on those thoughts Tuesday night after all-day policy sessions at the E2 Summit, which was organized by the private equity firm known as Solomir Capital, founded by Eric Scheuerman, Romney's former finance chair Spencer Zwick and Tag Romney, Mitt Romney's son. Ryan is one of Solomir's partners. Explaining his decision to leave the Senate, Romney noted that words such as bipartisan and compromise had become anathema to primary elections. In part because of the divisions in the House, he said, he had concluded that there would be far fewer opportunities to effectively move legislation with the small bipartisan group of colleagues that he has worked closely with, including Republican Senators Lisa Murkowski, Alaska, and Susan Collins, Maine, and Rob Portman, Ohio, who has since left the Senate, as well as Democratic Senators Joe Manchin III, W.Va, and John Tester, Montana, and Kyrsten Sinema, Arizona, a former Democrat turned independent. In the current political environment, Romney said, he did not think senators and House members would be able to solve his top 5 issues, addressing the emergence of China, reducing the nation's debt, parsing the threats posed by artificial intelligence and tackling climate change and immigration. "Those issues will require presidential leadership," he said. "I'm going to work like crazy for whoever the next president is," he said, to see if I can't get that president to finally address these issues, because the clock is running out. Former baseball star Steve Garvey running for California U.S. Senate seat. Former Major League Baseball player Steve Garvey announced Tuesday he is running for U.S. Senate in 2024 to fill the seat formerly held by Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat, California, who died earlier this month. Garvey, a Republican, has no political background and faces long odds in a state where Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump by nearly 30 points in the 2020 presidential election. But the former baseball star, who played for the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Diego Padres, is hoping his name recognition will give him a boost. "I played in front of millions of fans. I never played for Democrats or Republicans or independents, I played for all of you," Garvey, 74, said in his campaign launch video that featured several images from his baseball career. "Now I'm running for U.S. Senate in California, a state that I believe at one time was the heartbeat of America and now is just a murmur. Already there is a large field of Democratic candidates hoping to succeed Feinstein, including Representatives Katie Porter, Barbara Lee, and Adam B. Schiff." After Feinstein died, California Governor Gavin Newsom, Democrat, appointed LaFonza Butler to fill Feinstein's seat for the rest of her term, keeping his promise to pick a black woman in case of an early vacancy. Butler was sworn in last week as just the 3rd black female senator in history. Republicans have not won a Senate race in California in 35 years. However, Garvey could benefit from California's nonpartisan primary, in which all candidates are listed on the same primary ballot, regardless of party, and the top 2 finishers advance to the general election. In a statement, Garvey said his campaign would be focused on quality of life issues, public safety, and education. Garvey was not immediately available for an interview Tuesday. Garvey told the Los Angeles Times that he voted for Trump twice and did not have an opinion on the January 6, 2021, insurrection, in which a pro-Trump mob overran the U.S. Capitol seeking to stop Biden's electoral win. Garvey's announcement quickly drew attacks from some of his Democratic opponents. Lee issued a statement criticizing him as a pro-Trump, anti-choice extremist who was wrong for a progressive state like California. While I welcome debates and a robust democratic process, the idea that Steve Garvey defends the January 6 insurrection is incredibly troubling, Lee said. I look forward to the race ahead so voters can learn more about who each of the candidates on the ballot truly are. In a social media post, Schiff cast Garvey as a former first baseman turned multimillionaire Republican celebrity. Based on his announcement, it sounds like he's ready to take up the fight for everyone born on third base, thinking they hit a triple, Schiff wrote. Go figure. Democrat Thomas Suozzi launches bid to take back George Santos's seat. Suozzi, who left Congress to run for New York governor, joins a growing list of names seeking New York's 3rd congressional district seat. Long Island Democrat Thomas Suozzi on Tuesday announced a bid to retake his former congressional seat, now held by scandal-plagued Representative George Santos, Republican, New York, joining a growing number of candidates vying for the seat amid speculation that Santos could be forced out of office. Suozzi said Tuesday that he's filing a committee to run for Congress next year and that he will launch a formal campaign after local elections in November. The madness in Washington, D.C., and the absurdity of George Santos remaining in the United States Congress is obvious to everyone, Suozzi said in a statement on the social media platform X, formerly Twitter. Suozzi held New York's 3rd congressional district seat for 3 terms, defeating Santos when he first ran in 2020. Suozzi gave up his congressional seat to launch a bid for governor last year, but lost to incumbent Governor Kathy Hochul, Democrat. Before serving in Congress, Suozzi was Nassau County's executive and mayor of Glen Cove, New York. Last week, the Santos campaign's former bookkeeper, Nancy Marks, pleaded guilty to making false statements, obstructing federal campaign regulators, wire fraud and aggravated identity theft in connection with the congressman's fraud and money laundering indictment. Santos was charged in May with a number of financial crimes over allegations that he defrauded campaign donors by misusing funds and lied about his work status to get unemployment benefits he wasn't entitled to during the pandemic. He is also accused of falsifying information on required financial paperwork submitted to the House of Representatives. The freshman legislator, who announced his bid for re-election in April, has denied all charges. The congressman's scandals earned him a national reputation when it was revealed that he'd made an astonishing number of false claims about his background and qualifications while seeking office. Suozzi has been a longtime critic of Santos. In an op-ed for the New York Times shortly before Santos was sworn into office in January, Suozzi called his successor a con man. He called for Santos's removal from office by Congress or by prosecutors, because there is no indication that he will be moved by conscience to voluntarily resign. Some of the other Democratic contenders seeking Santos's seat include Democratic fundraiser Zach Melamed, former New York State Senator Anna Kaplan and Josh LaFaison, a member of the Nassau County Legislature. In statements Tuesday, both Melamed and Kaplan criticized Suozzi for leaving his congressional seat to run for governor. The last time Tom Suozzi represented this district, he decided to leave and launch a long-shot gubernatorial campaign, paving the way for George Santos, Melamed said. Voters on Long Island know better than to give him a second chance when he comes crawling back after cashing in as a lobbyist. Suozzi joined Actum, a consulting firm, as the company's co-chair in February. A news release announcing his arrival at the consulting firm said Suozzi would be providing strategic advice to clients and the firm's executive team and explicitly noted that as a former member of Congress, he is barred from lobbying the U.S. House and Senate for 2 years. Kaplan said Suozzi thinks voters on Long Island have forgotten that he abandoned us to George Santos. Santos also faces a handful of Republican primary challengers, including investment banker and Afghanistan war veteran Kellen Curry, former New York Police Department Detective Mike Saprayacone, and former Israel Defense Forces member Daniel Norber. Shayna Jacobs and Isaac Stanley Becker contributed to this report.